I never imagined that a weekend in a remote chalet could turn into the worst nightmare of my life. It all started as an attempt to escape the chaos of the city, a mountain retreat, surrounded by nature, silence, and solitude. But I was wrong. I still remember the feeling when I parked the car on that deserted road. The wind blew through the trees like a whisper, and the cottage seemed to watch me with its dirty, dusty windows like old eyes. It was only later that I realized what I felt was not loneliness. It was something much worse. Before we start, turn off the lights, put on your headset, and turn up the sound, and subscribe to the channel to help us keep bringing you video daily. What I'm going to tell you next is more than a story. It's a warning, and I hope you never have to understand what I went through. The road leading to the cottage was narrow, winding, and almost invisible among the dense trees. My GPS had stopped working hours earlier, and the few signs I found were covered in moss, almost illegible. When I finally arrived, the cottage emerged among the trees as a forgotten relic. He was bigger than in the photos. The dark wooden planks were warped by time, and one of the shutters hung crookedly, as if the place had given up standing. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of the wind, which made the surrounding trees sway. I got out of the car and climbed the creaking steps of the balcony. The key was where the owner had promised, under a cracked vase. When I turned the lock and pushed the door open, it opened with a long, plaintive creak. Inside, the air was dense, humid, with the unmistakable smell of old wood and abandonment. The main room had a stone fireplace in the corner, covered in ash, and antique furniture that seemed to be unused in decades. The only light came from the large windows. But even so, the place seemed dark, as if the house itself absorbed the light. I spent the rest of the day exploring the cottage. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, a tiny kitchen, and in the far corner of the living room, a locked door. The owner had not mentioned this door. That night, I sat by the fireplace, trying to get used to the silence. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. He looked at the windows every minute, certain that he would see something or someone outside. But there was nothing, only darkness. Later, as I lay down, I heard the first sound. It was a low, steady creak coming from somewhere downstairs. The sound woke me up in the middle of the night. It was a cadenced creak, as if someone was moving something heavy downstairs. I stood motionless, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that it was just the old house adjusting to the wind. But the sound continued. I got out of bed slowly, avoiding making noise. I picked up the phone to use as a flashlight, but the screen flashed with static lines before turning off completely. It was as if something was interfering. I went downstairs, my heart beating so hard it seemed to echo in the empty room. By the time I got downstairs, the sound had stopped. Everything was exactly as I left it. But as I walked through the locked door in the corner of the room, I felt a chill. The air around her was colder, as if the wood itself was frozen. At that moment, I knew something was wrong. I went back to the bedroom, trying to ignore the feeling that the house was watching me. But as I was trying to sleep, I heard another sound. This time it was the crack of a door slowly opening. I pushed the covers aside and went downstairs again. The basement door, the one I knew was locked, was ajar. An acrid smell came from there, a mixture of mold and something metallic, like rust. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. Inside, wooden steps descended into deep darkness. The light from the phone screen was dim, but it was enough to reveal a basement full of old boxes and furniture covered with stained sheets. In the center of the room, however, there was something that didn't seem to belong there, a circle drawn on the floor, made with a dark powder. Inside, symbols etched into the concrete looked like they were made with something sharp. I should have left right then, but for some reason, I knelt down and touched the circle. The dust was cold, almost icy, and as I touched it, a sound echoed around me, a whisper that seemed to come from all corners. I got up suddenly, my heart racing, and ran out of the basement. But as I closed the door behind me, I realized something terrifying. The key to the basement was in my hand. I didn't remember picking her up. The key to the basement was cold in my hand, as if it had a life of its own. The metallic weight seemed to pulsate, and the mark engraved on it shone faintly in the flickering light of the lampshade. I stared at her for a long moment, unable to understand how she had gotten there. I forced myself to put the key on the bedside table and lay down, trying to ignore the chills that ran down my spine. But sleep did not come. Every creak of the house made my body stiffen. Every gust of wind outside felt like a whisper in the distance. It was then that the sound came back. They were not footsteps, nor the creaking of wood. It was a low, continuous sound, something between a murmur and a breath. It seemed to come from all sides, filling the room. My hands started sweating, and my heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. I slowly turned my head to the bedside table, where I had left the key. She was no longer there. The sound intensified, becoming almost a lament. Suddenly I felt something, a weight on the mattress near my feet, as if someone had sat there. I didn't have the courage to look. I stood still, paralyzed by fear, as the weight moved, slowly approaching me. Finally, I forced myself to turn my head, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one, but the sheet was slightly sunken, as if it still bore the shape of something that had just come out. Before he could react, the door to the room creaked, opening slowly. "No," I whispered, not realizing that I was speaking out loud. The darkness in the hallway was total, but it seemed denser, as if something was there waiting. I picked up my phone on the table, desperate for any light, but the screen shook with lines of static unusable. A crack came from the hallway, like wood being twisted, followed by light, deliberate footsteps, ever closer. My body froze, my throat dry, unable to make a sound. And then everything stopped. For long seconds, the silence was absolute, but the tension in the air was unbearable. My eyes were fixed on the half-open door, expecting the worst. When I finally mustered up the courage to get up, I slammed the bedroom door shut and pushed the dresser to block it. The night was long, sleepless, every second full of dread. When the first ray of sunlight came through the window, my body gave into fatigue. I lay on the bed, without strength, and closed my eyes for a brief moment. When I woke up, the key was back on the bedside table. It looked brighter, as if it had been polished overnight. And next to it, there was something new, a small piece of paper, with a message written in shaky handwriting. "Don't look at the mountain." The next morning, the sunlight should have brought relief, but the cottage looked even more oppressive in daylight. The message next to the key disturbed me. Don't look at the mountain. What did it mean? Why was it there? And above all, who put it in? I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things as fast as I could, throwing everything in the suitcase anyway. Every minute spent in that place seemed to increase the weight on my chest. But when I opened the front door, something paralyzed me. Outside, the mountain was different. It was not something obvious, but a subtle and unsettling change. The trees seemed to be closer, as if they had moved through the night. The forest was silent, completely still, without even the sound of the wind or the birds. But the worst was the top of the mountain. A dark shadow hovered there, motionless, as if watching the cottage. I tried to ignore the feeling and ran to the car. As soon as I got in, I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The engine was completely dead. I tried again and again, but the car showed no sign of life. It was then that I realized the handprints on the rear window were back, but now they were sharper. They formed a pattern, similar to the symbols I saw in the circle in the basement. I got out of the car in a hurry, looking around. That's when I noticed something among the trees. A hooded figure, tall and motionless, watched me. I couldn't see his face, but I felt the weight of his gaze. I ran back to the cottage, locking the door behind me. My mind was in a whirlwind. What was that? Why did it seem that the whole mountain was alive? Suddenly, I felt the ground shake slightly, like a deep whisper coming from the ground itself. The fireplace went out by itself, and the room was plunged into darkness. A low, guttural sound echoed out, as if something was awakening. Without thinking, I ran to the basement. The door was open again, and the circle on the floor was different. The candles were lit, their flames flickering despite the absence of wind. And in the center of the circle, a shadow began to form, taking shape, growing, until it seemed to fill all the space around me. The figure turned to me, faceless, but overwhelming presence. My body froze, unable to move or even breathe. "Why did you set me free?" The voice rang in my mind, low and terrifying. I tried to speak, but no sound came out of my mouth. The shadow began to creep in, and the only thing I could do was retreat, stumbling over the steps. Before the darkness completely enveloped me, I heard one last sentence. "You will never leave the mountain." It is said that the cottage is still there, but no one who has tried to visit has been able to return to tell the story. What about me? Well, let's just say you'll never see the world the same way again once you've opened certain doors. I was never the type to believe in legends. Cursed canyons, haunted tracks, trains that appear and disappear in the night. All this has always seemed pure fantasy to me. At least, until the day I decided to follow that whistle sound in the middle of nowhere. It was a cold night, and the wind seemed to howl between the rocks. I had gone out to photograph nightscapes, something I always did to relax. But that night, my focus shifted when I heard the sound of something strange in the valley below. A train whistle. The detail is that canyon had no tracks for decades. I thought it was an illusion caused by the breeze, or maybe some distant sound distorting into the echo. But then I saw the light, weak and flickering, like a locomotive's lighthouse, dancing through the shadows of the canyon. It shouldn't have been there, but it was. Curious, or perhaps foolish, I grabbed my flashlight and descended the narrow trail, where slippery rocks threatened every step. The air seemed denser with each meter I advanced. And so, there he was, standing and imposing and completely wrong for that place. An old train, with wagons worn out by time, as if it had come out of a museum. If I had known what was about to happen, I would never have gone down that trail. As I went down the canyon, I felt that something was going on wrong. The silence was almost absolute, except for the muffled sound of my own breathing and the occasional crimping of insects. But there was something else, something subtle, a vibration in the air, as if the canyon itself was waiting for something. The train was stationary, illuminated by a faint moon that only accentuated its mysterious aura. The paint was worn, but it was possible to make out faded letters on the main car. West Line, 1907. The number sounded familiar, but I couldn't remember why. I approached cautiously. Each step felt like a final decision. When he was a few meters from the locomotive, the air became cold, as if all the heat from the canyon had been sucked in. I raised the flashlight, trying to illuminate the windows of the main car. They were covered in dense dirt, but still, I saw something move inside. I took a step back, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was my own shadow, a reflection. But then the sound came back, a deep, deep whistle, coming straight from the locomotive. It was impossible. There was no fuel, rails, or any sign of life. It was then that I realized something even more disturbing. The sound had not echoed. Whistles, voices, or even the sound of the wind naturally echo in a place like that. But this whistle died in the air, as if it were a sound that existed only for me. Then the main car door slid slowly, with a creak that sent shivers down my bones. For a moment, I was frozen in place. The door of the car wide open seemed like an invitation, or a warning. My flashlight trembled in my hand, but the beam of light did not reach the dark interior of the train. I knew I should go back, but something drew me in, as if an invisible hand was pushing me forward. With hesitant steps, I climbed the rusty steps of the entrance. The sound of metal beneath my feet echoed strangely, as if I were stepping on something hollow. As soon as I crossed the door, the air became even heavier, saturated with a smell of burning coal mixed with rust. Inside, everything seemed abandoned for decades. Faded velvet armchairs were covered in thick dust, and cobwebs hung between the corners of the windows. But there was something out of place. A porcelain cup rested on a table, intact and dust-free, as if someone had just taken it. My instinct screamed for me to get out of there, but before I could turn around, a sound made my heart race. Footsteps. Slow, calculated, coming from the narrow corridor that led to the next car. "Is there anyone there?" My voice came out weaker than I expected. Silence. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed to the hallway. That's when I saw it. An indistinct figure standing at the end of the wagon. She was tall and motionless, her dark figure contrasting with the faint moonlight streaming in through the dirty windows. My mind tried to rationalize. It could be a mannequin, an optical illusion, but when the footsteps resumed, the sound came straight towards me. I took a step back, the panic growing. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the cars. The figure stopped. Then, slowly, he turned his head in a mechanical movement. There was no face, just a dense shadow that seemed to absorb the little light around him. And then, in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. But the train began to move. I could hardly believe what was happening. The train, which had been motionless for seconds, now began to creak and shudder, as if it had taken on a life of its own. The sound of metal on rails was haunting, especially since I knew there were no rails there. I ran to the door I had entered, but it was locked. It was impossible. I hadn't closed it. I knocked on wood, screamed for help. But the only response was the increasing sound of the locomotive picking up speed. When I turned around, the hallway in front of me looked different. The dim lights of the chandeliers swayed, casting shadows that danced as if they had a will of their own. The dust that had once covered the seats and floor seemed to have disappeared, and now the car had the air of something recently used, as if it had never been abandoned. "This is not real," I mumbled, trying to convince myself. But it was. I advanced down the corridor, looking for a way out or something that would explain the situation. That's when I noticed that the windows no longer showed the canyon. Instead, a thick mist engulfed everything. It seemed to move in whirlpools, like living smoke that enveloped the train as it raced down an impossible path. As I got into the next car, I stopped abruptly. There were people, or at least something that looked like people. They were sitting motionless in rows of seats. They wore old clothes, woolen coats, felt hats, long dresses, as if they had come out of a photo album from the beginning of the last century. But there was something wrong with them. Their faces were turned down, hidden by shadows, and they didn't move, not even when I passed them. The silence was unbearable. I crossed the car as fast as I could, trying to avoid staring at them, but I couldn't help but glance at one of the passengers. It was an elderly man with bony hands holding a train ticket, and it was then that I realized. His fingers were deformed, too thin, as if they were made of something that was not flesh. I took a step back, and at that moment he raised his head. His eyes were empty, two dark holes that seemed to watch me and swallow me at the same time. Before I could react, he opened his mouth, but the sound that came out was not human. It was the same whistle I had heard before, only this time it came from inside the car, covering my ears. I ran to the next car, my breath choppy, and my mind screaming that I was stuck in something that didn't make sense. At the end of the hallway, I saw something that looked like a control booth. If I could get there, maybe I could stop the train. But what I found when I opened the door was much worse. When I opened the door to the control cockpit, I found no levers or instruments, but rather a room completely different from anything I could have imagined. It was like entering another time, another reality. The floor and walls were made of a polished metal that reflected my image in a distorted way. There were documents scattered on a central table, old maps that showed the canyon before the tracks were removed. Among the papers, a photograph caught the eye, a grainy image of a train going down the tracks of the same canyon, full of smiling passengers. On the back of the photo, in shaky handwriting, was written, October 14th, 1907, maiden voyage. A chill ran down my spine when the date finally made sense. It was the same one that was painted on the wagon. This was the train on the line that, according to local history, had disappeared more than a century ago. Gathering my courage, I continued to rummage through the documents. They told a fragmented story. The train line had been hastily built, with little concern for safety, and on opening day, a landslide engulfed the tracks and wagons in a deadly fall. No bodies were ever found. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. One of the papers mentioned a special passenger on board, someone described only as the engineer. He was the one who had insisted that the train be in the canyon that day, despite severe weather warnings. In the corner of the room, I found an old flashlight and a key. I took both, feeling they could be useful, and headed towards the next door. As soon as I opened it, I was greeted by an icy wind and the deafening sound of metal being bent. Outside, there was no more fog, but an impossible sight. The train ran along a track that hovered in the void, like a broken bridge connecting two worlds. Below, an infinite darkness seemed to pulsate, as if alive, waiting for something or someone. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, and there he was, the engineer. He wore an old uniform, but his face looked inhuman, twisted into a mask of pain and anger. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice reverberating as if he were part of the train itself. Before I could answer, he advanced towards me, with heavy footsteps, each movement echoing like thunder in the train corridors. His eyes, two pale flames, seemed to burn with an anger that came from another world. There was nowhere to run. I remembered the flashlight and the key I had found in the previous room. Trembling, I lit the flashlight and pointed at him, hoping it might slow him down. To my surprise, the light seemed to bother him. He stopped for a moment, long enough for me to run towards the next car. The train now seemed to be collapsing. The walls creaked, and the windows began to crack, as if the structure itself was crumbling under an invisible pressure. Each car I crossed seemed more distorted, with passengers who had previously been motionless now slowly standing up, their movements erratic and unnatural. In the last car I found something I didn't expect, an old control panel covered in dust and cobwebs. The levers were marked with symbols he did not recognize, but one of them had a legible inscription, "Emergency." Before I could think twice, I pulled the lever with all my might. The train shook violently, and a deafening sound filled the air. It was not a whistle, but a scream, as if the train itself were alive and dying. The engineer appeared again, this time closer, his face disfigured by fury. He raised a hand, and the entire train seemed to respond, the walls leaning and the deformed passengers advancing toward me. But something unexpected happened. The flashlight, which I was still holding, began to shine brightly, as if reacting to the desperation of the situation. The light spread across the car, burning away the shadows and the passengers, who were now screaming in agony. The engineer shouted something unintelligible and disappeared, dissolving into the light. The train began to slow down, and the fog that enveloped the windows began to dissipate. When it finally stopped, I was back in the canyon, alone and surrounded by the silence of the night. But something was still not right. As I looked at the horizon, I saw the lights of the train disappearing into the darkness, as if it were still there, waiting for its next victim. On the floor at my feet was the note of the old man I had seen in the car, but now instead of being in his hands, I had my name printed on it. The sound of a whistle echoed in the distance, and I realized that my connection to that train was not over. I never imagined that loneliness could be so tempting or so treacherous. When I decided to rent that cottage by a distant lake, all I wanted was some peace, a chance to escape the chaos of the city and the feeling of being constantly watched by eyes I couldn't see. But as soon as I arrived, I realized that something was wrong. It was the way the fog wrapped around the lake, like fingers tugging at a veil. Or maybe it was the silence, so dense that it seemed to swallow me. That night was the beginning of the end, of my end. The road to the cottage wound through the woods, surrounded by pine trees that closed in on me like the walls of a tunnel. The GPS indicated that I was only 5 minutes from the destination, but every turn seemed to drag on. The sky, which had started out sunny, was now covered by thick clouds, and the shade of the trees made the road even darker. When I finally arrived, there it was, the cottage. Small, with worn wooden planks and windows that looked darker than they should be. An almost ironic contrast to the cozy photos that had convinced me to rent the place. I stopped the car, and the sound of the engine died. Outside, the silence was absolute. No birdsong, just the wind blowing lightly, as if it didn't want to disturb the lake in front of me. The cottage was a few meters from the bank, The water was calm, but its surface was so black that it looked like a smudge of spilled paint. I felt a shiver go up my spine, but I shook the feeling. It's just tiredness, I thought. As soon as I entered, a smell of damp would envelop me. The interior was simple, but functional. A living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom. Everything seemed in order, except for one detail, a Polaroid nailed to the wall next to the fireplace. It showed the cottage, but with something that looked like an indistinct figure in the middle of the lake, barely noticeable in the fog. I took the photo, trying to understand what it was, but a sudden knock on the window made me release the image. My heart raced, but when I looked, there was nothing. Just the wind, I thought, trying to convince myself. That night, I tried to sleep, but the sound... Oh, that sound! It was like water moving, dripping. There was no rain outside, so where did it come from? The first night at the cottage was anything but quiet. That persistent dripping sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I got up several times, turning on the lights, looking for some badly closed tap, but there was nothing. The silence of the cottage was as oppressive as the darkness outside. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something different. It wasn't drip. It was a low, rhythmic sound, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the wood of the chalet deck. I lay motionless in bed, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door, my heart beating so loudly that it seemed to echo through the entire cottage. Finally, I built up the courage. I took my cell phone, turned on the flashlight, and went to the living room. The light flickered in my hands as it illuminated the floor and walls. Everything seemed normal until I reached the glass door that led to the deck. There were marks out there, wet footprints, coming and going towards the lake. The marks were small, like barefoot, and stopped abruptly on the edge of the deck. The light from the flashlight couldn't penetrate the darkness of the water, but something seemed to move down there. I closed the curtain in a hurry and convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, no one knew I was there. Sure, when the sun finally came up, I tried to shake off the restlessness of last night. I spent the day exploring the cottage and the surrounding grounds. I found a small locked cabinet in the kitchen, and after a few minutes of trying, I was able to open it. Inside was an old diary, the cover almost falling apart from being so wet. The pages were written in irregular and hurried handwriting. Most of it was illegible, but one sentence caught my attention. "Don't trust the lake. He observes. He waits." The words seemed to pulse on the paper, as if they wanted to escape from it. I closed the journal quickly, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked out of the kitchen window and was sure I saw something. A rapid, almost imperceptible movement on the surface of the lake. At dusk, the restlessness of the day gave way to an almost palpable fear. I avoided looking at the lake, but it always seemed in my field of vision, like a black mirror that attracted me mercilessly. I decided to distract my mind. I lit the fireplace and sat on the couch with the journal in hand. The sound of crackling wood was comforting, but the words on the paper made it impossible to relax. The diary entries told fragments of the story of a family that had lived there decades ago. The father, a man described as sunk in silence, is said to have built the cottage with his own hands. The tone of the notes changed at one specific point, when the author began to describe the lake's strange behavior. It is not just water. He feels it. He calls. The story continued, but a stain of water blurred the rest of the page. I was about to turn to the next one when I heard a loud sound. Splash. I ran to the glass door that led to the deck. Outside, the lake was in complete uproar. Waves were forming on the surface, although the wind was still. In the center of the turmoil, an object seemed to emerge slowly. It was a boat, a small wooden boat, with moss covering the edges. He wasn't there before. I walked to the deck, unable to resist the urge to approach. The boat was empty, but at the bottom there was something reflecting the twilight light, a rusty chain attached to a small, heavy chest. The trunk seemed to want to tell her story, but I didn't want to hear her. I took a step back, ready to run back to the cottage, but something caught my gaze. On the other side of the lake, near the opposite shore, a figure moved. It was difficult to discern the details, but it looked like a person, motionless, looking directly at me. My eyes burned, but I couldn't look away. When I finally blinked, the figure had disappeared. With my heart pounding in my chest, I ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. That night, there was no dripping sound, no footsteps on the deck, just the sound of something dragging on the bottom of the lake, like chains being pulled or as if the lake breathed. The next morning, the cottage looked even darker. The shadows on the walls seemed deeper, and the silence thicker. The lake was calm again, its surface reflecting the cloudy sky like a perfect mirror. But I knew that it was just a mask. I couldn't ignore the diary. I needed to understand more about what had happened there. I returned to the soggy pages, forcing myself to decipher the blurred passages. One passage, in particular, gave me goosebumps. They always come back to the lake. What has been taken is never completely gone. The phrase made me uneasy, but the sound of something moving outside made me drop the diary. The boat was back, anchored on the deck, bobbing slightly in the dark water. Something inside me knew I shouldn't get closer, but another part, the curious part, insisted that I needed to know. I took a flashlight and went down to the deck. The rusty chain was still there, wrapped around the small chest at the bottom of the boat. My heart was beating so hard I could barely breathe. With trembling hands, I pulled the chain and brought the trunk closer. It was heavy and covered with slime. Upon opening, the odor of moisture and rot was almost unbearable. Inside, there was a set of old photographs. The photos showed people in front of the cottage. The first one seemed normal, a smiling family posing on the edge of the lake. But as I flipped through, the photos changed. People's smiles faded, and their eyes looked dark, opaque. In the last photo, the whole family was inside the lake, with the water rising up to their shoulders. None of them seemed to struggle to get out. I let go of the photos, and the wind carried them out of the trunk. One of them landed at my feet. In it, there was something I hadn't noticed before. An indistinct figure in the background in the center of the lake, with something that seemed to be eyes shining. The lake was alive. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned the flashlight quickly, illuminating the empty deck. Dread took over, but before I could run, I felt something touch my ankle, cold, wet and firm. A scream stuck in my throat as I pulled my leg and ran back to the cottage. I locked the door and threw myself against it, trying to catch my breath. Outside, the sound of moving water and the creaking of the wood on the deck continued for hours. When the silence finally returned, I knew I wasn't alone. That night was different from all the others. The silence was not comforting, but oppressive, as if something waited patiently. I tried to convince myself that what happened on the deck was the result of my exhausted mind. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The diary remained open on the living room table, as if it were calling me. Reluctantly, I flipped through the last few pages, trying to understand what had happened to the cottage family. The notes became incoherent, as if the author was writing in despair. They called during the night, first at the lake, then at the door. Do not open it. My body froze when, at that very moment, I heard 3 knocks on the front door. The sound was low, but definite. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the sharpest knife I could find. I approached the door, each footstep echoing in the empty room. I peeked out the next window. There was no one. The beats came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave, but my voice trembled. No response. Only the rhythmic beats, like an ominous clock. Then, the sound stopped. For a moment I thought that maybe it was over, but then I heard it, a dripping sound. Not in the kitchen, not in the bathroom. It was coming from the ceiling. I looked up, and there it was, a dark stain spreading across the wooden ceiling. It was water, running slowly and relentlessly. The drip became faster, and within seconds, it felt like a heavy rain was falling inside the room. I ran to the door, determined to flee, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the cottage was alive, keeping me imprisoned. When I looked back at the ceiling, the stain had turned into something more, a pair of eyes, shining in the middle of the darkness, watching me. Suddenly, The fireplace burst into flames, illuminating the room. In the reflection of the window glass, I saw a figure behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The diary, now closed, began to emit a low sound, almost like a lament. At that moment, I realized what I needed to do. I took the diary and ran to the deck. The lake seemed to pulsate, like an immense and gloomy heart. The boat was still there, adrift. Without thinking, I threw the diary into the water. For a moment, all was silent. No sound, no movement, just the reflection of the moon in the gentle waves. But then, the lake began to bubble violently, as if it were boiling. A deep, distorted voice echoed around me, though I couldn't understand the words. The cottage shook, as if it were about to collapse. I ran to the car and turned the key. The engine roared, and I accelerated without looking back. As I drove down the winding road, the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the cottage, shrouded in fog, slowly sinking into the lake. I never told this story to anyone. I don't even know why I'm telling you now. The cottage is gone, but the lake is still there, waiting, watching. Sometimes at night I dream about him, and I always wake up to the sound of dripping water. Which of these stories scared you the most? Comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Until next time, if you have the courage to go back,